our special keynote speaker, Melanie Cervantes. So Melanie Cervantes has never lived far from the California coast. Born in Harbor City, California, and raised in a small city in the South Bay of Los Angeles, Melanie now makes her home in the San Francisco Bay Area, where she creates visual art that is inspired by the people around her and her community's desire for radical social transformation. Melanie's intention is to create a visual lexicon of resistance to multiple oppressions that will inspire curiosity, raise consciousness, and inspire solidarities among communities of struggle. In 2007, she co-founded Dignidad Rebelde, a graphic arts collaboration that produces screen prints, political posters, and multimedia projects that are grounded in third world and indigenous movements that build people's power to transform the conditions of fragmentation, displacement, and loss of culture that results from histories of colonialism, patriarchy, genocide, and exploitation. And Dignidad Rebelde's purpose is to illustrate stories of struggle, resistance, and triumph into artwork that can be put back into the hands of the communities who inspire it. So, welcome, Melanie.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be here with you all this morning. I really appreciate the invitation and congratulations on this inaugural gathering. It's very exciting. I know it's difficult to be distanced in this way, and yet we always find the ways to bridge ourselves, right? So that we can stay connected to one another. I think we're having a few technical difficulties with the slideshow, so I'm just gonna jump in and start introducing myself. My name is Melanie Cervantes. I'm one half of a project called Dignidad Rebelde. That term and idea comes from the revolutionary struggle of the Zapatistas in the south of Mexico. You know, they emerged in 1994 as a political movement because they were fighting back against what they could see was the coming of oblivion. And they called it that in their communiques because they could see what was coming down the pike. They could see the potential impact of what a free trade agreement being signed by Canada, the United States, and Mexico would do to devastate indigenous communities, and what it had already the kind of neoliberal policies, the way that neoliberal governments engaged things like paramilitaries to squash the organizing for good living and dignity and justice in indigenous communities. And so we adopted that term, Dignidad Rebelde, to reflect the inspiration that we've taken from seeing that movement emerge. We were both teenagers. My partner, Jesus Barraza, is the other half of Dignidad Rebelde. were both probably about 17 when the Zapatistas took up arms and declared war against Mexico. And so that really kind of reflects both the politic and the inspiration for us coming together to create something bigger than our individual selves. When we met, we both had individual art practices, and we both were very engaged with like youth organizing groups, and we wanted to do something more. We wanted it to be about collective efforts, about collaboration, about working together. And that's why we formed a project, in order to really be about more than the individual. You know, I think dominant culture, oppressive culture really emphasizes toxic individuality instead of really acknowledging the very necessary interdependence that we have with one another. And it's, you know, for us, very important to integrate that into our way of being as creative people. And that way of being is really informed by the container we created, right? And so that for us, Indignidad Rebelde is really about doing things collectively, doing things collaboratively. And I think the other kind of pillar of who we are is really informed by Chicana feminism. Chicanism, I think, really shapes the lens with which we look at everything, and that really brings in an intersectional lens into the work we do. And, you know, the Chicana feminists who really critiqued how the men in the Chicana movement excluded them, or took credit for their work, or, you know, really kind of relegated a division of labor that was highly gendered. Everybody could go on and on. Those things, as young people, I think we really learned about those experiences from the writing of Chicana feminists, and it highly influenced how we were like coming into the world as young people. And so those, I would say those two pillars of like Zapatismo and Chicanismo really ground us. We could go to the next couple slides. I think, or is the slideshow working now? Okay, yes, so next slide. I wanted to start talking a little bit about, go back one slide, talking a little bit about kind of a recent pivot. In 2017, I was diagnosed with a very rare form of lung cancer. I have a neuroendocrine tumor in the right upper lobe of my lung. And I went in to find out, you know, something that was going on with my shoulder, actually. And it kind of was like an incidental finding, but it was the most kind of shocking experience that I've had in my life. I did not expect to be diagnosed and delivered with the diagnosis on my 40th birthday. You know, it's not how I expected to go into the big 4-0. And yet there's so much that I can reflect on, that I've learned from a pretty difficult process. And I think Audre Lorde and her cancer journals became a place I found solace, because I didn't really know how to deal with everything that was going on. And I think this quote from her really kind of captures one of the things that you gain, because I think there's a lot that feels like it could be taken away in this process of illness and finding out. But I think one of the things it did for me, and possibly for Audre, was to really face one of the things that I think we might really fear in life, and that's the end of it. And to really hold and center the power that comes with that understanding. And I think I knew that in a really esoteric way, like Via Los Muertos, I think, has taught me a lot about the way that we are connected to life and death as a process, that it's like a continuum. And yet feeling it in my bones deeply didn't come until I really faced it. Next slide. And in the recovery from my treatment, which was a surgical treatment, I had to slow down quite a bit. I couldn't really be the kind of artist that I was. Printmaking is very physical. It's pretty demanding on the body. And so I learned that I could make adjustments and that I could kind of do something different. So that, like, this print I initially made with little eraser-like stamps that I would carve. And if I could just carve out one little pad a day, I felt like I did something. And for me, it was about like how I was learning to be in my body again and how I was listening to it and what it needed, because the recovery process is not quick. It takes time. And next slide. And I think I got to see that too in making work. And in addition to kind of like the physicality and the process of it, I really started to understand that illness, it wasn't just, what was happening to the cells in my body. It was actually, a lot of it was rooted in these very old traumas that I had experienced and unaddressed traumas. And I really started to look inward at all things that hadn't talked about and that I hadn't addressed in the work that I made, and that maybe felt uncomfortable. And so I started to make work that was addressing issues that maybe were a lot more personal in ways, but at the same time, even in those personal experiences, very universal and big. And so addressing things like child sexual abuse, and writing about what it means to break the silences around the issue of child sexual abuse, and what it means to honor young people's autonomy over their bodies and their ability to say what is okay and what is not okay. Like, that was an opening for me to start to say things even when they're uncomfortable. Next slide. And for me, I think, the emotional roller coaster that came with getting sick also was really about that internal mirroring, looking at myself and really seeing everything I experienced and everything that I'd gone through. And, one of the big revelations was being able to finally talk about struggling with suicidal ideation. For 40 years, I never told anyone, not one person, that I had struggled my entire life with thoughts of suicide, with plans of suicide. And, finally, in the process of healing from this surgery, I started to face those things. I started thinking about how celebrity suicides have such a big platform and attention, and we feel things, right? Because often those celebrities, maybe a comedian made you feel something, their stories made you connect to something, connect to, a human part of you. And so we feel that loss, we feel that grief. And for others, sometimes it can be really triggering because you might have a personal loss in your life that gets overshadowed, right? Like, that maybe doesn't get the attention you feel it deserves. And that question really made me kind of dig into researching like how suicide is an issue in different communities of color and different marginalized communities, and how it impacts different communities in particular ways, right? So there's like high incidences across communities, and for some communities it might look like it's more about like making the plan, or for some communities like you have certain ways that young people in particular are impacted, and you might have higher rates based on gender. There's just a lot of ways that communities can be impacted and are impacted. And of course, the rates are really high in communities of color and marginalized communities. And for me, like, it was all ways of thinking about this feeling that I've struggled with my whole life, in order to get to the place where I could say something to myself, where I could affirm myself. And so this piece is really about that. It's just a reminder in those times when I'm really struggling to stay, to give myself a chance in this world. And so this was a very big shift from the years and years of very political, didactic, issue-based work, starting to really look at and connect the dots between what I have experienced as an individual and kind of these larger political issues, and really kind of understanding my place in that world of struggle. Next slide. Next, yeah. And so I think in addition to kind of like really identifying specifically some of the things that I've been struggling with, or my community's been struggling with, I also really started to pay attention to what I have in my hands, what is left here with us. And so the ideas that were, of the solitude of loneliness, like to really reflect on this worldview that we aren't alone, that we're never alone, that our ancestors are always with us, and that in the original instructions that we were all given, that we were given instructions on how to be good people in this world amongst all the other life, and that there's reminders of how to do that. And so like the things that we still have in our hands, the way we have ceremony, the way we put an altar together, the things that we have in our everyday lives, which include food, that is so critically important, that tell us who we are, that tell us where we come from, that tell us how to be. Like I really started to pay more and more attention, because, in a lot of ways, they were that very important medicine. So like nopales, I think in the first slide, I showed the technical part of, making these little cactus pads. But part of what I was reflecting on that is like, it was a huge part of my recovery diet. Like cactus was something I drank in smoothies, I ate it. And for me, it was like really important. My grandfather lived into his late 90s, and to control his blood sugar, like he really relied on nopales in his diet. And so like, even just knowing that, he was born in the late 1800s. We have I was born in 1977. We have a large span of time in just a couple generations. And so to understand that, like when we talk about ancestors, sometimes it can feel very ephemeral, but like it's very connected to like the people that we love, and the folks that are close to us generationally. Next slide. So some of what I want to share also is, in addition to the practices that have developed in coming to grips with this illness, I also was like trying to figure out how to do what I did before finding out that I was sick. And so for most of the time that I was recovering, lots of things were happening politically in the world. Next slide, including the increased, next slide, attention and kind of spotlighting of the detention and separation of families by ICE and Border Patrol. And so at the time in the news cycle, there was a lot of attention on the children, right? And yeah, I think it was Newsweek, one of the publications had that picture of the woman with her little girl being, you know, and the little girl is crying. And in the news cycles, we were just seeing, you know, the suffering of migrant families. You know, it was like trauma porn in a lot of ways, and it just kept cycling and cycling. And I just kept thinking about the great harm that comes from seeing that level of dehumanization and suffering. And I think the flaw in thinking and the real issue is that, you know, it's deployed as a way under the assumption that you can garner sympathy or empathy from folks that, you know, maybe don't know anyone who's a migrant. And I just think, yeah, but at what cost and to whom? You know, I think if people are so committed to the dehumanization of folks, I'm not sure showing people suffering is gonna convince them of people's humanity. And so for me, one of the things that was really important that happened during my recovery was like, I really looked at the work that had come before me. And I had been looking quite a bit at the work of Emory Douglas and the Black Panther Party. Excuse me. You know, a lot of the political graphics that he created for the newspaper, the Black Panther Party newspaper, were incredibly centered around the dignity of people in his community. And, you know, just pouring myself into his work, which, you know, I've always been a fan, but I think I had a different kind of time and attention during the recovery. I felt like that really influenced this piece because I wanted to restore dignity visually because I saw it being kind of pulled away in the mainstream media. And for me, this was a way to do that. Next slide. And I was still recovering physically. I couldn't physically do the same things that I normally would have in the past. And I didn't want that to stop me. So instead of succumbing to like a despair because I couldn't get back to what I normally did, I just adjusted. And we opened up our studio and invited people to come help produce this print over the course of a week. And we printed 250 of these posters. The last day, we used a community space to print with families and children. And we printed, I think, like the last 50 posters. And all of these posters were distributed and we collected donations. And with those donations, we were able to reinvest the resources so that we could distribute 13,000 copies of the poster as posters and stickers. And then we were able to decentralize, you know, the distribution and the use of these posters. Next slide. And so they went on to have a life of their own. I mean, for a lot of time, that because that print event happened sometime in 2018, early 2018. And as I was preparing for this, I was like curious to see if I could find something that I wasn't aware of. And so I found this headline in a paper, and I believe this was in Mount Vernon. And so this is an example of how the poster has life in organizing, right? And I have no idea the group that organized this, but I think this is an example of how the work can be out in the world and live out in the world. And this for me is also part of that healing and recovery of dignity, which is highly important for me. Next slide. Can we do the next slide? Another kind of critical aspect of our tradition is that we are sustaining a way of making work that has been going on for a really long time. Like we're just like newer kids on the block, but we're sustaining a tradition. Like there have been people who have been making imagery that is rooted in social movements for at least a few hundred years, and there's connection between the generations of people that have done that. And so like this poster is an example of me acknowledging visually those that came before. So it's highly influenced by OSPAL, the Organization for the Solidarity of the People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And they were created in the late 60s as, an oppositional publication. They started a publication called the Tricontinental. And within the Tricontinental, every centerfold was a political poster. And those political posters often had at least 3 to 5 languages, where they would translate the main slogan of the poster. And so this poster was created after a dentist visit. I had time to read a fairly long article that was documenting how what we now sometimes refer to as the Arab Spring started and happened, and kind of like the chronology of it. And I was very inspired to see how everyday people in Tunisia and Egypt finally said, enough is enough. This is not working anymore. And, we have to change things. And they, I think the initial call was for the ousting of Mubarak. So, for me, making a political poster to show solidarity with something that was happening on the other side of the world, it felt like a small gesture. I was like, I'm just here in San Leandro, just doing this small gesture to say where I stand. Next slide. And the call, was to go to our embassies and take a stand. And little did I know that in Bangkok, activists were able to download the poster like the night that I put it up. I went to sleep. And the time difference, right? They were able to take that to a copy shop, make a print, and go to their embassy in Bangkok and demand the ousting of Mubarak. And I found out much later, of course, and it was really heartening, next slide, to see what I saw as just this very small action could connect to someone else's actions, and that we could have that kind of momentum, even across space, even across time. And so we did the same. This happened before, in the chronology, before I had any knowledge of what, these organizers in Bangkok had done. So we did the same though. Like we're like, okay, let's make a poster that we'll take out to our mobilization in San Francisco. And it was wonderful. We took it out. And it's funny because this is what we do. And especially for folks in the Bay, like you know, we try to do political graphics that we can give out in community. And we always have this moment where we feel nervous, like, does anyone even want this? Like, is this the right thing to put out? And the day that we mobilized here, I remember just seeing dozens of high school students from the local high school here in San Leandro, who are part of a social justice academy, walking towards us. And we had been doing a little bit of work with them. And so it was just this moment where I was like, yes, we're doing the right thing. These are our people in our community. These are the folks that we see at the grocery store, and they're activating. And for many of them, it was the first time any of them had been at a protest. And that was, for us, that connection. It was like being active in our community is incredibly important, and to see that flourishing in young people is also important. And so, you know, that poster is that connection we had as community members with the young people. Next slide. So it's important to do those analog things, to hand pull the posters. And this picture is not that great, but let me tell you, it's also incredible. So this photo, someone tagged me on social media to say, you know, this photo's kind of dark, but I'm taking it into Harrier Square. I brought this poster from San Francisco, you know, from the Bay, on a plane with me to bring it here with the youth movement, who I think at this point, Mubarak had already been ousted, but they were really kind of trying to address the military junta that came in behind him in terms of power. And so, you know, the poster made it, you know, made its own way to have life. And this is an analog poster. This isn't like the digital poster that was downloaded. And so even years later, you know, someone held on to this, because I think this was maybe like 2 years after everything initially started. You know, someone felt like they wanted to carry that message here from the Bay. And I was so happy that they shared it back with me. Next slide. I also think for us, you know, there's many solidarities, and for us, often we're listening for the call to action. And so when the young people who had the vision for the prayer that happened in Standing Rock went to the elders and said, like, this is what we need to do, we were incredibly inspired, and we said, how can we help? And, you know, of course, the thing that we do is the political graphic, and so we connected with some of the young people to be able to amplify their message, to amplify them. This young woman, Bobby Three Legs, was an incredible leader in Standing Rock. And they really wanted, the young people really wanted to be able to echo their message as much as possible, because they were getting opportunities to speak, like in the media, about what was happening in Standing Rock. Next slide. With the Dakota Access Pipeline, with the potential threat to the water, as a warning to the world, like, if this happens here, it will happen everywhere. You know, this is something that everyone should be paying attention to. And so for us, being able to support the young people and their leadership, you know, they wanted shirts that they could wear. They were being interviewed. We sent them posters. And we worked with other artists, next slide, to be able to create banners that they could use when they would go out onto the highway to pray. And again, as the media was out there, they were able to use that to echo the message, right? Like, it's just a way to amplify what folks were saying anyways. And we were able to go to the encampment for about a week. And, you know, that's really all we did, was make artwork while we were there. You know, one of the beautiful things is, I think in that prayer, it was about bringing the best of yourself. And I was like, I'll do whatever they ask me. If they ask me to chop wood, I've never chopped a piece of wood in my life, but I'll try, right? But I'm going with that open heart and that, that spirit of like, what can I do to help? I was like, I hope they ask me to do something that I actually have a little bit of competency in. And it was amazing because like we brought clothing that had the graphics and we gave it away as soon as we like set up our tent. And luckily we were able to do that. And we met people from the kitchen, like close to where we were sleeping. And they were like, we'll take care of you. You'll always have a meal here because we know that's what you're here to do. And it was like this moment where I was like, what if this is what life could be like, where you just were tasked to do what you're best at and to bring it to the community as a way to serve the community. It was like, I don't know, like, I wish I could convey the feeling of what that living like that just for a week even meant. It was hard to come back to this reality of continually trying to survive capitalism and deal with all these issues and forces that want to have us live the way that we live, in a lot of ways. So for me, like being on the lands there had so much, and hopefully we were able to give back just a little bit. But this is kind of another example of like the type of solidarities that we practice. Next slide. I think, another part of what's really important in what we're all doing is memory. And there's this incredible violence in forgetting, right? Like we live in a country, in a colonial project that functions and necessitates a kind of amnesia in order to continue to advance and eviscerate every last ounce of energy, spirit that they can, right? Like the slogan about eating the rich, like I could see how people react to it. And I'm like, but the reality is we're the ones getting eaten. We're getting eaten every single damn day. And so what does it mean to remember, right? To remember against that violence of forced amnesia, against the violence of forgetting, against the violence of kind of the reshaping of our stories that are based on our real experiences. We're not just, like I hear a lot of talk about narrative and storytelling, and I'm like, that's how we make sense of the things we are experiencing. Because I was noticing, I forget what right winger, I was like listening to something. It was the Attorney General. I don't know if folks saw Megan Thee Stallion's performance on Saturday Night Live. It was really amazing. She basically did a visual performance. It was like her background dancers and her in the front had this amazing kind of visual written display in the back, and she used sound clips from Malcolm X and Tamika Mallory to really indict the Attorney General in Breonna Taylor's case and to call him out. And it was really amazing. And I was watching this clip of an interview with him where he was saying, that she's just trying to match this narrative. And it was, what I noticed in this interview was like, this idea of narrative is being weaponized as a way to say that it's like, almost like it's like structured in a lie, as opposed to being structured in the reality of people's experiences and the stories just being the way that we talk about it. So it was like this moment for me. I was pissed. I mean, I think that guy's pretty deplorable. And that is something that we have an opportunity to do. All of us have the opportunity. I mean, I think the Say Her Name effort, that is what that effort is about. It's about remembering, it's about uttering, it's about like putting the spirit back into the conversation that we're having, because we can't forget. Like, one of the things that's really exciting news and kind of shocking is recently, in the past week or so, our district attorney has decided, under the pressure of organizing, of course, to reopen the Oscar Grant's case. Oscar Grant was killed in 2008, turning into 2009. You know, I don't think that would be possible historically. It's taken social movement to and memory to demand that, right? Like, there's this collective memory in the organizing to say that we're not going to forget, and we're not going to let go of the memory of the folks whose lives are being stolen by the state, by the ever violent policing that happens in communities. And it's violence. All policing is violent. Like, I don't use the term police brutality because policing is brutal all the time. You know, I think the thing that we have to do is understand that, like, the limits of policing are very few, and that in that there's so much violence in the way that policing is carried out. Next slide. And so for us, again, coming back to like, what is the little grain of sand that we can put into the beach? It is like the visual, it is the mark that we can make. And this is how we, as human beings, have been telling stories since time immemorial. You can go all around the world, and you know, every day new stories are being unraveled because we're uncovering histories that have been there always, right? But now we, you know, the visual storytelling is there, or there's, you know, things that are artifact that tell us a little bit of that story. And so for us to use visual storytelling, to use graphics as a way to communicate and convey feeling, politic, memory, vision, all of that is informed by things that have happened always, right? Like, we're not necessarily innovating that. We're just sticking to what we know what works. Next slide. So this is the first Oscar Grant poster that we created and distributed at the very first rally that happened, I think, in Ogawa Plaza, which is now referred to as Oscar Grant Plaza really regularly. And, you know, the thing about this moment is like, this is when organizations were being born that are winning now. You know, it took all that time. You know, like, this protracted history is really important to understand because everything builds upon each other. So there's an organization that's local called the Black Organizing Project, who successfully were able to pass a resolution called the George Floyd Resolution, which eliminated the police department, a whole police department that existed in Oakland high schools, funded, you know, to be its own department within Oakland high schools. And they were finally able to pass that resolution. They've been working, that organization was born, you know, it was a seed of an idea this day, and it came, you know, the fruit of that organizing, you know, happened this summer. So that's the kind of protracted organizing. And for us, you know, being able to be in community with folks like that, you know, this is the little grain of sand that we add, you know, being able to remember someone. Next slide. And for us, like, what does it look like to be successful? Sometimes the question says, and for me, it's like, when community decides the work is theirs, when people embrace it to such a degree that it just becomes part of and parcel of who they are. And like, for example, we didn't make shirts. I don't know how these shirts are created. I think this person might have made them, Tracy. But that to me is how we know we've done something that's effective. Next slide. Is to see community breathe life into it. Like, this is another image that I found. Again, I wanted to see if I could find how the graphics are used beyond what I put out. And so this is a close-up from a news film, and this person took the poster that I designed and added to it. Like, they added additional messaging and used this, you know, in front of the TV cameras. And, you know, they added abolish all systems of oppression now in the name of Breonna Taylor. And I was like, this is fantastic. I love that. And for me, that's the example of, like, you know, is it something that is effective? And for someone to, like I said, take it up as their own and to bring life into it in the organizing, that to me is, you know, a small gesture that I can make to help, hopefully, in that remembering, because it's so critical to making change, right? It's so critical. If we forget, if we don't understand where we've been, I don't know how we know where we're going to go. I don't know how we're going to move forward, because we won't understand what that path is. Next slide. So the last thing I want to share with you is actually really a short video that was created by our friend Lucas. And it really, you know, I think sharing some of what I've done is great, you know, in the stills. And there's something that video really allows us to feel and witness in a different way that I find really powerful. And so this is just a really short 2-minute video. It's of a practice that I can't wait to get back to once we can get to a point where this pandemic is really under control. There's a print party that we organized in order to bring together artists and organizers who were trying to show their solidarity, trying to, like, get involved around the issue of solitary confinement in prisons, and at the time, youth detention. And so we worked with some of the organizers who were working with the folks on the inside who were asking us to take action on the outside around this issue. And we did this in order to prepare for a legislative hearing on the devastating effects of solitary confinement. So we can go ahead and push play. So I share that because I think it's also really important to say, I was thinking about the project that we have. It's not just us alone. That we have this incredible network of people that we collaborate with and connect with to try to do something more to kind of come together. Like, I don't know, this might be dating me, like Voltron, right? Is like this cartoon where these different figures came together, and when they came together, they created a bigger figure. Like, I like to think of how we work as that. And then I'll just close with one of my newer pieces that I created in order to really reflect upon the time we're living in. I thought a lot about the use of masks, and there's definitely a line of folks that are very resistant to using the mask. But I really thought about, like, what is it in my community of folks that I see and hear? And it is this sense of collective care, that I wear this mask to take care of you, and you wear a mask to take care of me. And that it's like this collective effort on the part of everyone who is, out in the world and doing that. And so this was just really, I thought an important thing to say, because always, like in mainstream media, the focus is on the more toxic and negative aspects of things happening, right? So in the news media, you see these cycles of, like, people having fits at a Starbucks and throwing things, and those things are true. And also the story of, like, the kids that learn how to make masks and distribute them to their communities, like, those don't get in the cycle of news. We don't get to hear that over and over. And so for me, this last piece, and I think the work that I do in Jenna, it's like a small intervention into the poison that we're inundated with, because we see something like 2,000 to 5,000 images every single day. And a lot of it is advertising, and a lot of that advertising, when you analyze it, really boils down to a product saying you're not good enough, you're not worthy enough unless you buy this thing, right? Like that thing will complete you. And that's just capitalism, right? That's how it keeps going. And so, yeah, if I could interrupt that just for a moment, in that sea of images that we are bombarded with, that's what I've kind of committed my life to doing. Just a kind of, we interrupt this message to kind of moment to say that you are worthy, you are complete, you are whole, and you are loved. And you are never, never alone. Thank you. I think we have time for questions now. And I'm not exactly sure if we're going to do them in the chat or if people will do them live.
Yes, Melanie, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, sharing your time with us. This is actually, I haven't heard about you before this conference, and I helped put it together, and I was just in awe of all your pieces, and you're so amazing. So happy to have met you, even if it's just virtually. For our participants that are with us today, please drop a word in the chat that describes the emotion Melanie elicited out of you, or words of wisdom that she shared that put you in awe, so that we can help build community. And while y'all are putting that down into the chat, I'm just going to share some things that you shared with us today that really resonated with me. I loved how you said illness is not only physical and that it's rooted in old unaddressed traumas that we experienced. I've heard something similar like that before, but not put in a way that I feel everyone can relate to, because that when our core needs are compromised, it really causes us to look inwards. So thank you for sharing that with us and for reminding us about that. I also love how you said, I don't use police brutality because police are brutal all the time. Love that. I love how you're sustaining the work that has come before you and honoring and magnifying those voices. You're amazing. So we're going to open up the floor to questions. If anyone has a question, you can text me or chat me directly, or you can take yourself off mute. You have some love coming into the chat, Melanie. I wanted to look through it. While people are thinking of their questions, I do have a question for you. One of the first pieces that you had shared with us was that cactus picture with the word resilient on it. And I feel that resilience is a word that is used in many different ways, in many different connotations, and it can mean things to different people. So what does it mean to you?
So in that piece, I was really reflecting on how the natural world has lessons for us. And I think the nopales, right, like they are able to thrive in such extreme conditions, right? The heat of the desert in the day is excruciatingly hot. And then the cold of the desert at night, like they're just such extreme. And you know, there's not a lot of water around. And when I think of plants, I think, man, it's all the things that plants don't thrive in, and yet nopales do, right? They're full of so much wisdom, and they're full of nutrients and healing. And for me, it was about, like, I think, you know, Bruce Lee said, be like water. I was like, how, you know, like a nopal, what does it mean to thrive in these conditions, right? I was recovering from lung cancer surgery, and the thing that I'm not supposed to thrive in, that, you know, like these conditions are hard, and how can I still reach for that? I think some of what you might be alluding to is, like, I think some of the way that I've seen the notion of resiliency has been in the relationship to oppression, right? And being resilient within the context of that oppression. And I think, you know, the quote that I see used most is Malcolm X's quote, is like, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have it memorized. Like, basically, like, you don't stab me with a knife and then pull it out 6 inches and then call that progress. And I think that's the critique of resilience and the notion of resilience within that context. And I think it's accurate, right? Like, you just don't, you don't stay thankful for that, you know, like, it's not, that's just not, that, to me, that's not what I'm addressing. And I think it's a very different context, and it's very problematic to, you know, and a lot of it is about politicking, right? Like, I think I often see it within the context of, like, whether things are going to change, and that can often be grounded, like, in policy change. And so these crumbs are always thrown, like, here, and be grateful for it. And be grateful that we're killing people in your community less, but people are still going to die, for example, to be a little bit, I don't mean to be flip about it, but yeah, I think in that context, I see it as needing to be problematized, because, yeah, like, I think what I I was addressing there. So it's something different. It was about like looking for lessons and how to heal myself, like and with the Nopal.
Yes. I couldn't have put that better myself in terms of resilience and the way that it's used in our society today. So thank you for your words again. Does anybody have any questions before I take up all the time?
I have a question. Sorry about that. First of all, yeah, thank you so much. It's honestly so inspiring to see somebody doing work in something that I'm really passionate about and making impact. I guess I kind of mentioned it in the chat, but I've had a difficult time in the past creating something that can kind of envelop all of the feelings of anger and passion and care into a single piece. And I'm curious to hear more about your process of like when something moves you, how do you translate that onto a print?
It's changed. Before I was diagnosed with cancer, my process was really different. I was often architecting everything. Like I was like, okay, this poster is going to be about this thing. And I'm like planning it in my head. And, you know, first this will happen and then I'll put it together and this is what it'll say. And so it's very planned out and almost like prefabricated in my mind. And then one thing I started to do was experiment more with like intuition and trusting myself, which is sometimes very challenging for me and maybe for others, is to trust even when it's not in my head. So I said, I gotta stop only relying on my head. I have to trust my heart and my gut. One of the things that I've done over time is do some work around like somatic therapy and somatic work. And so in that process, I really learned about like how there's lots of neurotransmitters in your heart and your gut. And I think it's in your gut, you in your brain. And so I was like, okay, how do I start to really tap into that? And so I started doing more intuitive marks. Like I would just sit with a marker and paper and just mark, like literally just let myself go. And that's how the piece about suicide, the one, The World is Better With You in It, that's how that was created. It did all of it that way. And it was scary. It was, you know, frightening not to have a map of where I was going in my head. I was like, I don't know where I'm going. But I'm learning to trust myself. And that is also about addressing trauma. I'm like, there's a lot of trauma that I have that keeps me from trusting myself. So that's a newer process, and I'm trying to do that more and more. It takes a different amount of time. So for creating a piece about something particular, let's just take the Breonna Taylor piece, for example. I just spent a lot of time looking and feeling the grief. A lot with pieces about people who have been murdered by the state. It's a whole a grief process, and it's hard because most of the time it's not people I know directly, but there's still a grieving process that happens, and it takes time. So like, you know, it took a lot of time and until I saw an image where I felt like she was looking back at me, and often that's something I'm looking for, like being able to see. And then from there, everything else just, I trust the intuition of what I'm doing, you know, like trust that gut. And some, you know, like for me, it's not just trusting me. I think spirit guides as well, ancestors guide as well. Because sometimes, you know, I might get kind of stuck and I do something else. And then it comes to me and I'm like, I have no idea how that happened. But, you know, when I really think about it, I do. I'm like, yeah, because I was being assisted. So that's some of it. And I think also too, I've started making things, I'm like, what do I want? What would I want to be handed? You know, if someone was saying, would you like a poster? So I've been doing that a little bit more too. So I have a lot of different, I think, strategies for trying to get myself there. But I think fundamentally, the technical part of doing it isn't as important as this deep commitment to learning how to trust myself, which is not easy at all. It's actually really challenging. So that would be, you know, that would be like if you were asking me for advice, spend some time with yourself and think about and maybe write about, or, you know, however you do, and ask yourselves those questions when you're, you know, want to do something. What are some of the things you start hearing in your head, or you know, either telling yourself, or maybe it's someone else's script. I'll give this example. My sister talked about how she was never wanted to do anything visual because when she class, or, you know, art project in a class, like probably like as a second grader, and she got made fun of. No, she might have even been younger than that, because she was so excited and she went ahead, and then like a teacher's aide who was probably like a middle school kid, who knows, I don't know if it was like an official aide, held it up and said, don't go ahead or your fish will turn out like this one, you know, and she shamed her in front of the class. And I'm like, you know how many people have a story like that in public education experience, probably private education too, people that just traumatizing that was for her. You know, she was almost 50 still talking about that story. And so like there's a voice, it's that person's voice telling her like that she's doing it. So she doesn't even try. So I think, you know, that is also another piece. Like start trying to like identify, is it someone else's voice? Is it something you're telling yourself? Because I think those conversations are super important, and it's part of our liberatory practice, right? If we're going to get free, we have to free ourselves from those things that have become internalized too. You know, oppression internalizes. And so that's part of our work as well. Yeah, you can do it. I'm sure you have so much to share with us that we need.
Thank you. That's really beautiful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Melanie, once again. Thank you for everyone who has joined us for this amazing keynote speaker. Melanie, come back, please, whenever we have this conference next. We will be switching over to our workshop sessions after this. The first one starts in a couple of minutes at 11:35. You should be able to see what workshop options are available to you through the email that was sent out to you yesterday, and then you can also be updated via Slack. But I think that is it for now. Thank you so much, Melanie. It's been an honor.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for being here. I'm going to save the chat and then I'm going to email you just the affirmations and appreciations folks had typed in the chat.